Girls' night out. Isabella and Chloe were two typical American teenage girls. After school, they spent all of their time together, watching scary movies, having sleepovers, shopping for new clothes. They liked partying, keeping up with their friends, having fun and just enjoying life. They had no way of knowing the horrible fate that life had in store for them. One night, Isabella and Chloe decided to have a girls' night out. They planned to sneak out to a nightclub as soon as their parents went to sleep. Isabella kissed her parents goodnight and went upstairs to bed. When she thought that everyone had gone to sleep, she took out her cell phone, called her friend Chloe and told her to meet her at the store down the street. Chloe agreed and hung up. Isabella quietly opened her bedroom window, trying not to wake anyone. She stepped out onto the windowsill and climbed down the drainpipe. As she walked down the deserted street, she got a strange feeling that she was being watched. The hairs on the back of her neck pricked up. She glanced behind her, but she was alone. When she came to the corner store, there was nobody around, so she took out her cell phone and called Chloe. "Okay, I'm at the store," she said. "Hurry up or I'm going home." "What's wrong?" asked Chloe. "I don't know," replied Isabella. "This just doesn't feel like other nights. Something isn't feel right. I've got a bad vibe." "Stop it. You're just being paranoid," laughed Chloe. "I'll be there in 2 minutes." Isabella hung up the phone, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching her. 5 minutes later, Chloe turned up and the two girls walked together to the nightclub. The girls were too young to get into the club, but the bouncers never asked them for ID. They strolled inside and pretty soon, they were dancing to the music and flirting with guys on the dance floor. Around 3 a.m., Isabella was chatting to a really cute guy who must have been at least 10 years older than her. Suddenly, she felt her phone vibrating in her pocket. It was a text message from her ex-boyfriend Anthony. She hadn't heard from him since they broke up a month ago. The text read, "Come outside, I've got a huge surprise for you." Curious, she looked around and saw Chloe busy talking to some other man. So, without saying goodbye, Isabella walked out the door of the nightclub. She had just taken a few steps, when she received another text message. It read, "Meet you around the corner over by the dumpster." The street was dimly lit and deserted. Isabella had a bad feeling in the pit of her stomach. Something didn't feel right, but she told herself she was just being overcautious. Inside the nightclub, Chloe was looking for her friend. After waiting for 15 minutes, she began to grow impatient. She scanned the dance floor, but there was no sign of Isabella. She even checked the toilets, but they were empty. At 3:27 a.m., a relieved Chloe got a text from Isabella. It read, "Meet me outside now, hurry." When Chloe got outside, she received another text. "I am around the corner over by the dumpster, come watch me sparkle." Chloe followed the directions, crossing the dark and lonely street. When she rounded the corner, she was confronted by a horrific sight. Her heart almost froze in her chest. Isabella was hanging upside down from a street light in the parking lot behind the dumpster. Sparkling Christmas tree lights were wrapped around her ankles. There was a large pool of blood below her. Her body was completely stripped of clothing, revealing deep wounds along her stomach and chest. Chloe fell to the ground and began screaming hysterically. Some people who were standing at the door of the nightclub heard her cries and came rushing over. When they turned the corner and saw Isabella's bloody corpse hanging in front of them, they were horrified. The police were called and they questioned Chloe for hours. Still in a state of hysteria, she could barely talk. Sobbing uncontrollably, she told them how she and Isabella had sneaked out that night and gone to the nightclub together. She tried to remember all of the guys they had flirted with on the dance floor. They asked her if she knew of anyone who would want to harm Isabella, but she couldn't think of anyone. As much as she wanted to catch Isabella's killer, she was of no help to the investigation. During the interrogation, one of the cops produced a plastic bag and took out a blood-stained envelope. "We found this lodged in your friend's throat. It's addressed to you," said the cop as he handed her the envelope. "Chloe" was scrawled across the front. With trembling hands, she took out the piece of paper inside and read it. The letter read, "Maybe if you stayed in bed like you were supposed to, things like this wouldn't happen. Don't go sneaking around at night. Bad things can happen." The cops had to grab her before she fainted. An ambulance took Chloe to the hospital and she was treated for shock. When Chloe returned home the next day, she was still shaken. Her parents told her that Isabella's ex-boyfriend, Anthony, had been arrested for the murder. He was later released after passing a lie detector test. He claimed his phone had been stolen on the day of the murder. The police didn't rule him out as a suspect in the case, but they didn't have enough evidence to charge him. As fate would have it, Isabella's murder would remain unsolved. Nobody was ever brought to trial for the crime, and as time went on, people began to forget about it. 2 years had passed and Chloe had almost managed to forget about the terrible night when her best friend had been savagely murdered. One night, she called her boyfriend and asked him to meet her at the park. It was about 2 a.m. She began to walk to the park, but felt a strange presence, just like the one Isabella had told her about, the night she was murdered. She was almost to the park when the feeling came across her, so she let it go. Her phone beeped. It was a text message from her boyfriend. "Almost there, baby, love you lots." It made her feel much better. Her last task was to pass by the store. The park was on the other side. She began to walk but heard something behind her. Immediately she began to run. Her boyfriend got to the park and waited for about 15 minutes. At 2:35 a.m., he got a text from Chloe. It read, "Keep walking forward and you will circa me." He did as the text suggested and walked forward. There, hanging upside down from a tree, was the mutilated body of Chloe. Christmas tree lights were wrapped around her ankles and she was completely naked and covered in blood. He called the police and was interrogated all night. The next day, when Chloe's boyfriend got home, there was a letter waiting for him on his parents' doorstep. It was stained with small drops of blood. The note inside read, "Don't go sneaking around at night. Bad things can happen. I wish I could tell you that the murders of Isabella and Chloe were solved, but that's just not the case. Today, the police say the investigation is still ongoing, but they have no new leads. The murders are seldom spoken about nowadays. They were high-profile cases at the time, but due to the strange lack of evidence, people soon forgot about them. Everyone who was involved went on with their lives." You may be wondering how I know so much about these cases. Well, I'd rather not go into it, considering it is still an ongoing investigation. If you must know, I was the cop who was assigned to the case. I was the cop who handed Chloe the blood-stained letter. You may also be wondering why the murders were never solved. Well, like I always say, don't go sneaking around at night. Bad things can happen. Mary Shaw. Beware the stare of Mary Shaw. She had no children, only dolls. And if you see her in your dreams, make sure you never, ever scream, or she'll rip your tongue out at the seam. And if you see her, remember this: the only thing that can stop her is dead silence. There's an old ghost story around here about a woman named Mary Shaw. She was buried with her doll collection. Now, some say it's just a scary poem parents tell their kids to keep them in line, but others claim it's more than just a ghost story. There are things you remember, and there are things you can't forget. Like the look on that woman's face when she died. Her name was Mary Shaw, the ventriloquist who lost her voice. Back when I was a boy, those were the glory days of Raven's Fair, and the town built itself a grand old theater, the Guignol Theater, out on Lost Lake. I only ever went there once. It was 1941 and Mary Shaw was the ventriloquist on stage. She had a dummy called Billy. That night, during her performance, a young boy named Michael Ashen made fun of Mary and called her a fraud. He claimed he could see her lips moving when the dummy was talking. Some weeks later, that disbelieving little boy went missing. Vanished without a trace. For his family, there was only ever one suspect, Mary Shaw. In fact, everyone in town felt that Mary Shaw must have played some role in it. And not long after that, she was murdered. Who killed her? No one ever found out for sure. According to the legend, some members of the Ashen family dealt their own brand of justice. Along with other folks from Raven's Fair, they stormed her dressing room at the theater. They forced her to scream, then ripped out her tongue, silencing the ventriloquist's voice forever. Or so it seemed. In her will, Mary stated that her dummies were to be buried with her. Her children, as she called them. All 101 of them. Her body was brought to my father's mortuary, so he could begin work on her other final request. Not only did she ask to be buried with her dolls, she asked to become a doll herself. But she didn't stay dead. She came back and took her revenge. Ever since she was buried, Raven's Fair has been plagued by death. One by one, each of the men involved were killed. They were found with their tongues ripped out. And then the same thing happened to their wives. And then their children. And their children's children. No one in this town dares speak Mary Shaw's name, let alone go near her grave. They know she won't stop killing until the screaming does. Bobby. There was woman named Suzanne who lived in an old house on a cliff overlooking the sea. She was divorced from her husband. Suzanne had been deeply depressed ever since her son Bobby drowned. She was devastated by the loss and felt like she couldn't go on. As time went by, Suzanne began reading books about black magic and Satanism. The more she read, the more she became immersed in the world of the occult. It was like an addiction. She came across a spell that was supposed to be able to resurrect the dead. One dark night, she drew a pentagram on the floor of her living room. Lighting some black candles, she stood in the middle of the pentagram and at the stroke of midnight, she read aloud from an ancient satanic book. Come fulfill my desire and do my bidding in accordance with my will. I conjure thee in the name of Satan to whom all evil is obedient, by which name, the earth is overthrown, the seas turn black, the ground shudders, fire is quenched and all host of things in heaven and hell do tremble. Lucifer, Prince of Darkness, return my son who drowned by accident. Return him to me now, I command thee. Afterwards, Suzanne blew out the candles. She collapsed to her knees and began to weep. All of a sudden, she heard a faint scratching on her front door. Cautiously, she walked over to the door and listened. The scratching grew louder. "Who's there?" she cried. There was a long silence and then she heard a voice whisper, "Mommy." Suzanne opened the door and was shocked to see a small boy crouched on the doorstep. He was soaking wet and shivering with the cold. "Bobby," she cried. "It's you. It's really you." She hurriedly brought him inside and put a towel around him, trying to warm him up. His teeth were chattering and his hands were shaking. "I was so lonely and desolate without you, Bobby," she said. "Where were you? What happened?" "I remember water," he said. "Cold water. And I couldn't breathe. I woke up and couldn't remember who I was. I walked and walked in the rain. These people found me and they took me in. I didn't know if I was alive or dead." "You're alive, Bobby," she cried. "You're really alive." "Was I a good boy, Mommy?" Bobby asked. "Of course you were a good boy," she replied. "Did you love me, Mommy?" Bobby asked. "I do love you," she replied. "From the bottom of my heart." "Were you nice to me, Mommy?" Bobby asked. "Of course I was," she said. Bobby stared at her. It was a mean, angry stare and there was a spiteful sneer on his face. It frightened Suzanne. "I want to play a game with you, Mommy," he cried. "Hide and seek." All of a sudden, he raced up the stairs. All of the lights in the house went out. "Bobby, what are you doing?" she cried. "Where are you?" There was no answer. "Bobby, stop this," she cried. "I want you to come right back here. Bobby, please don't do this to Mommy. Bobby, for the last time, what are you doing?" Just then, she heard the boy's voice coming from the darkness. "Aren't you glad the lights are out, Mommy?" he said. "It makes the game more fun." "You're going to hurt yourself in the dark," Suzanne replied. Suzanne cautiously walked up the stairs, feeling her way in the darkness. When she got to the top, she looked around, straining her eyes to see. "Bobby, stop this now," she shouted. "You're making Mommy very angry." All of a sudden, the door burst open and Bobby was standing there, cackling like a maniac. In his hand, he held a long, sharp kitchen knife. "Let's play hide and seek now, Mommy," he shrieked. Suzanne recoiled in horror. Backing away, she tripped and went tumbling down the stairs. When she landed at the bottom, she looked up and saw her son coming down the stairs with the knife raised above his head. "You lied, Mommy," he said. "Bobby didn't really drown by accident. You knew that. Bobby drowned himself. He couldn't stand the way you treated him and he killed himself just to get away from you. Don't you see? Bobby didn't want to come back, Mommy. No. Bobby hates you, Mommy. He didn't want to come back, so he sent me instead." Just then, there was a flash of lightning and it lit up the house. For one terrible moment, Suzanne saw the face of the thing that had come back instead of Bobby.